The truth behind this 1880 family photo is darker than anyone imagined. The call came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Dr. Angela Freeman, director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., listened as a lawyer from Jackson, Mississippi, explained that his firm was handling an estate clearance and had found a collection of Civil War era and Reconstruction period photographs that might be of historical interest. Most are typical plantation scenes, family portraits, that sort of thing, the lawyer, David Chen, explained. But there's one photograph that's single quotes unusual. It shows a white family with what appears to be a black child among their children. Given the date 1880 and the location in Mississippi, we thought your museum might want to examine it. Angela felt a familiar mixture of interest and apprehension. Photographs from that period often revealed uncomfortable truths about race relations in the post-Civil War South. Can you send me a digital scan? The image arrived in her inbox an hour later. Angela opened it on her large monitor and studied it carefully. The photograph showed a prosperous white family posed formally in front of a large house, a stern-faced father in his 40s, a rigid mother in an elaborate dress, 4 children ranging from perhaps 6 to 14 years old, and among them, unmistakably, a child with darker skin and tightly curled hair who appeared to be about 10. The composition was typical of the era: stiff poses, formal clothing, everyone staring solemnly at the camera. But the presence of the mixed-race child was notable. Integrated family portraits were extremely rare in 1880 Mississippi, especially among wealthy white families. Angela zoomed in on the child's face. Unlike the white children who stared directly at the camera with typical Victorian solemnity, this child's eyes were cast downward, expression withdrawn. The body language was different too. While the white children stood confidently, this child seemed to shrink inward, shoulders hunched. Something about the photograph troubled Angela deeply, though she couldn't immediately identify what. She forwarded the image to her colleague, Dr. Marcus Washington, a historian specializing in Reconstruction-era Mississippi, with a note, "What do you make of this?" Marcus called her within the hour. "That's the Thornton family of Vicksburg. Robert Thornton owned one of the largest cotton plantations in Warren County before the war. The family maintained considerable wealth even after emancipation." He paused. "But I've never seen any record of them having an adopted black child." That would have been almost unheard of in 1880 Mississippi, especially for a family of their social standing. Could the child be a servant? Angela asked. Possibly, but why include a servant in a formal family portrait? And look at the positioning. The child is standing among the Thornton children, not off to the side where servants were typically placed in such photographs. Angela stared at the image, that sense of wrongness intensifying. "I need to see the original photograph. Can you come to Jackson with me?" 3 days later, Angela and Marcus sat in a conference room at the law firm in Jackson. The original photograph laid out on the table between them. It was mounted on thick cardboard backing, remarkably well preserved for its age. The photographer's mark on the bottom read, J.T. Morrison, Portrait Photography, Vicksburg, Mississippi, June 1880. Angela had brought portable, high-resolution scanning equipment. As she carefully positioned the photograph under her camera system, Marcus examined the cardboard backing for any writing or notes. He found a single line in faded pencil. "The Thornton family with Ward, summer 1880. Ward," Marcus repeated. "That's an interesting word choice. Not adopted child or even servant. Ward suggests a legal guardianship arrangement." The high-resolution scan took several minutes. When it completed, Angela opened the file on her laptop, and both of them leaned in to examine the extraordinary level of detail the technology had captured. At this magnification, individual threads in the fabric were visible, as were tiny imperfections in the photographic emulsion. Angela systematically examined each person in the photograph, zooming in on faces, hands, clothing. The Thornton family members showed typical signs of wealth-quality fabrics, elaborate styling, jewelry on the mother and daughters. Then she moved to the black child, positioned between 2 of the white daughters. "Oh my God," Angela whispered, her hand freezing on the mouse. Marcus looked closer. "What did you find?" Angela zoomed in further on the child's ankles, visible below the hem of a simple cotton dress. There, barely perceptible at normal magnification but unmistakable at this resolution, were dark marks circling both ankles, scarring that formed complete rings around the lower legs. "Those are shackle scars," Angela said, her voice tight. "Chain marks." This child was kept in leg irons. Marcus felt his stomach turn. They'd both seen similar scarring in photographs and medical records from the slavery era, the permanent damage caused by heavy iron shackles worn for extended periods. The weight of the chains, the constant chafing, the infections that inevitably developed all left distinctive scarring patterns. In 1880, Marcus said slowly, 15 years after abolition, this child was being kept in chains. Angela examined the rest of the child's visible skin. On the forearms, partially hidden by the long sleeves of the dress, were more marks, thin lines that looked like healed cuts or lash marks. And around the neck, just barely visible above the collar, was bruising or scarring that suggested a collar or restraint of some kind. This wasn't adoption, Angela said. This wasn't guardianship. This was captivity. Angela and Marcus spent the next week in Jackson, diving into courthouse records, city directories, newspaper archives, and any documentation related to the Thornton family. They needed to understand who this child was and what had happened to her. Robert Thornton's plantation, Oak Hill, had been one of the most prosperous in Warren County before the Civil War, with over 200 enslaved people working his cotton fields. After emancipation, Thornton had struggled financially like many former plantation owners, but he'd managed to retain his land and rebuild his fortune using sharecropping arrangements that kept formerly enslaved people in conditions barely different from slavery. In the 1870 census, the Thornton household included Robert, his wife Carolyn, 4 children, and 6 black domestic workers listed as servants. But by the 1880 census, taken just weeks after the photograph was made, something had changed. The household now included only the white family members and 2 adult black servants. No children were listed among the servants. Where did the child go? Angela wondered. She's in the photograph in June 1880, but not in the census enumeration in August. Marcus found part of the answer in the Warren County property records. In May 1879, a year before the photograph, there was a guardianship petition filed by Robert Thornton regarding a Negro child, Clara, approximately 9 years of age, orphaned and in need of Christian guidance and proper upbringing. The petition claimed that Clara's mother, identified as Bessie, formerly enslaved at Oak Hill Plantation, had died in childbirth and the father was unknown. Thornton requested legal guardianship to provide for the child's welfare. The petition was approved without investigation. Clara, Angela said softly, finally having a name for the child in the photograph. But who was Bessie, and was she really Clara's mother? They searched death records and found Bessie listed as dying in March 1879, age approximately 26, cause of death, complications of childbirth. But there was no birth record for any child born to Bessie in 1879. In fact, based on Clara's apparent age in the photograph, she would have been born around 1870 or 1871 years before Bessie's listed death. Marcus found something else disturbing. In newspaper archives from 1878, there was a small notice in the Vicksburg Daily Herald. Bessie, Negro woman formerly of Oak Hill Plantation, seeks information regarding her daughter Clara, age 7, removed from her custody under disputed circumstances. Any information to be directed to the Freedmen's Bureau office. Removed from her custody. Angela read aloud. Thornton didn't find an orphan. He took a child from her mother. The Freedmen's Bureau had operated in Mississippi from 1865 to 1872, helping formerly enslaved people navigate freedom, reunite families, and address disputes with white employers. Though the Bureau had closed 8 years before Clara appeared in the Thornton photograph, their archive records might contain information about Bessie and her daughter. Angela and Marcus traveled to the National Archives facility in Atlanta, where Freedmen's Bureau records for Mississippi were preserved. After 2 days of searching through hundreds of complaint files, they found Bessie's case. The file contained a complaint filed in November 1878 by Bessie, who gave her full name as Bessie Williams. She stated that she had been enslaved at Oak Hill Plantation and had given birth to a daughter, Clara, in 1871 after emancipation. Bessie had worked as a paid domestic servant for the Thornton family while raising Clara. In October 1878, Bessie had decided to leave Oak Hill to take a position in Vicksburg that offered better wages. When she attempted to take Clara with her, Robert Thornton had physically prevented her from leaving with the child, claiming that Clara belonged to the plantation and would remain there. Bessie's complaint was heartbreaking in its desperation. Mr. Thornton says Clara is his property under the old ways and he will not release her. He says no court will take the word of a Negro woman over his word. He keeps Clara locked in the quarters at night, so I cannot take her. I am her mother and I love her and I beg for help to get my daughter back. A Freedmen's Bureau agent named Thomas Crawford had investigated the complaint. His report was dated December 1878. Visited Oak Hill Plantation. Mr. Thornton claims legal guardianship of the child, Clara, based on the mother's inability to properly provide for her. The child appears adequately housed and fed. Mr. Thornton has obtained a court order granting him temporary guardianship, pending a formal hearing. Without legal counsel, Bessie Williams has little recourse. Recommended she obtain a lawyer, though it is unlikely any local attorney would take a case against the Thornton family. There was one more document in the file, a note added in March 1879 by another agent, Bessie Williams deceased. Complaint case closed. Angela sat back, the full horror of the situation becoming clear. Thornton had used the legal system to steal Bessie's daughter. When Bessie tried to fight back, she found no help, and then she died under suspicious circumstances, leaving Clara completely at Thornton's mercy. The death certificate said childbirth complications, Marcus said. But there's no record of any baby born in 1879. Because she wasn't pregnant, Angela replied. I think Bessie was murdered, and her death was disguised to look natural. They needed to learn more about the photograph itself and the circumstances under which it was taken. Angela located descendants of J.T. Morrison, the photographer whose studio had created the Thornton family portrait. Morrison's great-great-grandson, Daniel Morrison, still lived in Vicksburg and had inherited boxes of his ancestors' business records. Daniel welcomed them into his home and brought out several ledger books and a collection of glass plate negatives carefully preserved in wooden boxes. My great-great-grandfather was one of the premier photographers in Vicksburg, Daniel explained. He documented many prominent families. I've been meaning to donate these to a museum, but never got around to it. Angela showed him the Thornton family photograph. Daniel flipped through one of the ledgers and found the entry. June 15th, 1880. Thornton family portrait. Sitting fee paid in full. Note: unusual circumstances. Child appeared distressed and bore visible marks of harsh treatment. Mrs. Thornton insisted child be included despite obvious reluctance. Are there any other notes? Marcus asked. Letters, journals, anything that might give more context. Daniel pulled out a thin folder. My great-great-grandfather kept correspondence related to difficult commissions. Let me see ... He found several letters and photographs. Here. This relates to the Thornton portrait. The letter was dated July 1880, written by J.T. Morrison to a colleague in Jackson. I find myself troubled by a recent commission. The Thornton family of Oak Hill requested a family portrait including a Negro child they claim as their ward. The child bore unmistakable signs of physical restraint and abuse, shackle scars on the ankles, marks on the arms and neck. During the sitting, the child was clearly terrified, and the white children treated her with casual cruelty, pulling her hair and pinching her when they thought I wasn't looking. When I questioned Mrs. Thornton about the child's welfare, she coldly informed me that the girl requires firm discipline to overcome her savage nature, and that I should mind my own business. I considered reporting the situation to authorities, but what authorities would listen? The Thorntons are among the most powerful families in the county. I have instead documented every visible mark and injury in the photograph with maximum clarity. Perhaps someday, when justice is possible, this evidence will matter. Angela felt tears in her eyes. The photographer had seen what was happening to Clara and had tried, in the only way available to him, to create evidence. He deliberately captured the shackle scars, the abuse marks, the terror in Clara's eyes, documentation that would outlive him and potentially bear witness to terrible crimes. Is the original glass plate negative still here? Angela asked. Daniel nodded and carefully retrieved it from one of the wooden boxes. The negative showed even more detail than the print. Every scar, every mark, every sign of Clara's suffering was preserved in extraordinary clarity. Angela and Marcus returned their focus to determining what had happened to Clara after the photograph was taken. The fact that she didn't appear in the 1880 census, taken just weeks after the portrait, was ominous. They searched death records, finding no certificate for Clara in 1880. They checked orphanage records, school enrollments, church registers, nothing. It was as if Clara had simply vanished. Marcus found a clue in an unlikely place, a memoir written in 1935 by a woman named Martha Thornton, one of the white daughters visible in the 1880 photograph. The memoir, titled Memories of Old Vicksburg, was in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History collection. Most of the book contained pleasant reminiscences of antebellum and Reconstruction-era life, but buried in a chapter about household management. Martha had written, "Father believed in strict discipline for the servants, though his methods were at times severe by modern standards. I recall we once had a ward, a colored girl named Clara, who proved incorrigible and had to be sent away for proper correction. I was but a child myself and do not recall the details. But I remember Clara's frightened face and my mother's cold insistence that the girl's removal was necessary for the safety of our family. Sent away for proper correction," Angela read. Where would they send a black child for correction in 1880 Mississippi? Marcus's face grew grim. There were several options, none of them good. Private reformatories, which were essentially prisons. Work camps where convict leasing allowed children to be worked as virtual slaves. Or worse, there were cases of black children simply being sold into illegal servitude in remote areas where federal authorities couldn't reach. They searched records for reformatories and work camps operating in Mississippi in 1880. Most had burned down or had their records destroyed. But Angela finally found a reference in state legislature documents from 1881, a report about deplorable conditions at the Mississippi Industrial School for Colored Youth, a reformatory near Jackson. The report, filed by a reform-minded state inspector, described horrific abuse, children beaten, starved, worked to exhaustion in cotton fields. Many children sent there never returned home. The mortality rate was approximately 30% annually. Angela obtained what few surviving records existed from the institution. In a ledger dated August 1880, she found an entry. Clara, Negro girl, age approximately 10, committed by guardian Robert Thornton of Vicksburg for correction of behavioral deficiencies and theft. Term, indefinite. There was no exit record. No release date. No indication that Clara had ever left the institution alive. Angela knew they needed more than documents. They needed testimony, oral history, any living memory of what had happened at places like the Mississippi Industrial School. She reached out to genealogists and historians in the black community, asking if anyone had family stories about children sent to reformatories in the 1880s. An elderly woman named Grace Patterson, 94 years old and living in Jackson, contacted Angela through her granddaughter. Grace's grandmother had survived the industrial school and had passed down stories about her time there. Angela and Marcus visited Grace in the nursing home where she lived. Despite her age, Grace's mind was sharp, and she'd spent years preserving her grandmother's oral history. My grandmother Ruth was sent to that place in 1882 when she was 11 years old, Grace explained. Her mother had died and her father couldn't care for her alone, so a white family offered to take her in. But they worked her like a slave, beat her, and when she tried to run away, they had her sent to the reformatory for theft, though she hadn't stolen anything. Grace pulled out a worn notebook. Before grandmother died in 1948, she wrote down everything she remembered about that place. She wanted someone to know what happened there, even if nobody would listen at the time. Angela read through the notebook with growing horror. Ruth had described conditions of shocking brutality: children beaten daily, fed minimal rations, forced to work from dawn to dusk in the cotton fields. Many died from disease, malnutrition, or injuries from punishment. Bodies were buried in unmarked graves behind the institution. Then Angela found a passage that made her heart stop. There was a girl named Clara who came to the school in the summer I arrived. She was about 10, very thin, already had scars on her ankles from chains. She told me her mama had died and the white family took her. She said they kept her locked up at night, made her work all day, and hit her if she cried. She was so scared all the time. Clara got sick that first winter pneumonia, I think. The people who ran the school didn't get her a doctor. They said medical care was too expensive for Negro children. She died in January 1881, and they buried her out back with the others. I never knew her family name. I never forgot her face. Grace looked at Angela with tears in her eyes. Is that your Clara? The girl in the photograph? I think so, Angela said softly. I think that's exactly who it is. The Mississippi Industrial School for Colored Youth had closed in 1903 after multiple scandals and investigations. The property had been sold and developed over the years, first a factory, then demolished, and now it was the site of a shopping center on the outskirts of Jackson. But according to Ruth's account and other historical records, there had been a burial ground behind the institution where dozens of children had been interred in unmarked graves. Angela contacted the state archaeologist's office to determine if anything remained of that burial ground. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, the state archaeologist, was immediately interested. There have been rumors for years about children's graves in that area, she said. But we've never had enough documentation to justify an excavation. Your evidence changes that. Patricia petitioned the state for permission to conduct a ground-penetrating radar survey of the area behind the shopping center. When the results came back, they confirmed what Angela had feared. The radar detected at least 40 anomalies consistent with unmarked graves, each approximately the right size for a child. The discovery made national news. Pressure mounted for a full archaeological excavation and proper memorialization of the site. The shopping center owner initially resisted, but eventually agreed after public outcry and the threat of historical preservation lawsuits. The excavation began in the spring. Angela stood alongside Patricia and Marcus as archaeologists carefully uncovered the first grave. The skeletal remains were small, clearly a child of perhaps 9 or 10 years old. Nearby were fragments of cheap cotton fabric, the remains of the simple dresses the institution had provided. Over the following months, the team excavated 37 graves. Most contained children between the ages of 8 and 14. The skeletal evidence showed signs of malnutrition, disease, and, in many cases, traumatic injuries consistent with severe physical abuse. One grave, located where Ruth's account had suggested Clara had been buried, contained the remains of a girl approximately 10 years old who had died in winter, based on soil analysis. The skeleton showed evidence of previous leg injuries consistent with shackle scarring, and the bones indicated severe malnutrition. We can't be absolutely certain this is Clara, Patricia said gently, but the age, the timing, the location, and the evidence of previous restraint all match. Angela stood at the edge of the excavation, looking down at the small skeleton that might be Clara, the terrified child from the photograph, taken from her mother, held captive by the Thornton family, and finally sent to die alone in a brutal institution. She'd been buried without ceremony, without a marker, without anyone to mourn her or even remember her name. She deserves better, Angela said. They all do. The discovery of the children's burial ground sparked a national conversation about the post-Reconstruction treatment of Black children, about institutions that had operated as little more than child labor camps and prisons, about the systematic violence and exploitation that had continued long after slavery was legally abolished. Angela worked with community leaders to plan an appropriate memorial. The shopping center owner donated the land where the graves had been discovered, and the state legislature allocated funds for a memorial park. Each child would receive a proper burial with a marked grave. For most of the children, names were impossible to determine. Records had been destroyed or were too incomplete. But for Clara, they had enough evidence to give her an identity and tell her story. On a warm June morning, exactly 145 years after the Thornton family photograph had been taken, hundreds of people gathered for a memorial service. The 37 children were reburied in individual graves, each marked with a simple but dignified headstone. For the children whose names were unknown, the stones read, "Unknown Child, remembered and honored." But Clara's stone bore her name, Clarice, 1870-1881, beloved daughter of Bessie Stolen, enslaved, never forgotten Grace Patterson, now 95, spoke about her grandmother's memories and the importance of bearing witness to historical injustices. My grandmother Ruth never forgot Clara. She carried that child's memory for 67 years, and she passed it to me so I could pass it to my children and grandchildren. Clara's story matters. These children's stories matter. Dr. Marcus Washington spoke about the historical context, how after the formal end of slavery, new systems of oppression had emerged, how Black children were particularly vulnerable. how institutions like the industrial school had operated with impunity because their victims had no power and no voice. Then, Angela revealed the Thornton family photograph on a large screen, zooming in to show the shackle scars on Clara's ankles, the marks of abuse, the terror in her young face. The crowd fell silent, confronted with visual evidence of what had been done to this child. This photograph was taken as a symbol of the Thornton family's respectability and status, Angela said. But the photographer, J.T. Morrison, made sure he documented something else, the truth about how Clara was being treated. He couldn't stop the abuse. He couldn't save her. But he could create evidence that would outlast all of them, evidence that would eventually allow Clara's story to be told. She continued, Clara was kidnapped from her mother Bessie, held captive under the guise of legal guardianship, kept in chains, and worked as an unpaid servant. When she became inconvenient or when her suffering became too visible, she was sent away to die in an institution. Her captors faced no consequences. They lived long, prosperous lives and were remembered as pillars of their community. Angela's voice strengthened. But today, we remember Clara. We speak her name. We acknowledge what was done to her and to thousands of children like her. We can't give her justice. It's 145 years too late for that. But we can give her memory and recognition and the dignity of having her truth finally told. The Thornton family photograph became one of the most significant artifacts in the National Museum of African American History and Culture's collection. It anchored an exhibition about post-Reconstruction violence and exploitation, about the various systems created to continue oppression after slavery's legal end, and about the children who suffered and died in institutions designed to control and exploit them. But Angela's work didn't end there. Inspired by Clara's story, she launched a national project to identify and memorialize other children who had died in similar institutions across the South. Researchers found burial grounds at dozens of former reformatories and work camps, uncovering hundreds of unmarked graves. Each discovery prompted new research, new memorials, new efforts to tell the stories of forgotten children. Descendants came forward with family histories, grandmothers and great-grandmothers who had survived these institutions, who had carried traumatic memories for decades, who had passed down stories that were finally being validated and honored. The Thornton family descendants, living across several states, responded with varying degrees of acknowledgement. Some expressed shock and shame at their ancestors' actions. Others denied the evidence or minimized the severity of what had been done. But the historical record was clear, documented not just in archives but in that photograph, undeniable evidence of a child held in captivity. Martha Thornton's descendants donated her full papers to the Mississippi archives, including private letters that revealed more about Clara's captivity and the family's attitudes. In one letter to a sister, Martha's mother Carolyn had written in 1880, "The Negro child has become more trouble than she's worth. She cries constantly for her dead mother and refuses to accept her proper place. Robert has arranged for her removal to a corrective institution. I confess I will be relieved to have her gone." That cold dismissal of a terrified 10-year-old's grief and trauma spoke volumes about the dehumanization that had made such cruelty possible. The most moving response came from Bessie's descendants. Through genealogical research and DNA analysis, Angela's team had traced Bessie's family line. Her sister's descendants still lived in Mississippi, and they had passed down family stories about Bessie and her daughter who had been stolen by the White family, Clara's great-great-niece. A woman named Jasmine Williams traveled to Mississippi for the memorial service. She stood before Clara's grave with tears streaming down her face, holding a photograph of Bessie that had been preserved in the family for generations. "We never forgot," Jasmine said. "We never forgot that Bessie had a daughter named Clara. We never forgot that she was taken. We never forgot that Bessie died trying to get her back. The white people who wrote the history books forgot, or they deliberately erased it. But we remembered, and now everyone knows." The photograph of Clara standing among the Thornton children, her ankles bearing the scars of chains, became an iconic image, a stark visual representation of the violence and exploitation that had continued long after slavery's legal end. Schools used it to teach about Reconstruction, about the black codes and convict leasing, about how systems of oppression evolved and adapted. Sarah continued to examine historical photographs at high resolution, finding other hidden evidence of abuse and exploitation. But Clara's case remained the most powerful, a single image that told a story of kidnapping, captivity, institutional murder, and a mother's desperate attempt to save her child. The photograph looked innocent at first glance, just a prosperous family with their children. But zoom in, look closely at the scars on that one child's ankles, and the truth became visible. The truth that had been there all along, waiting 145 years for technology to catch up, for someone to look closely enough, for someone to care enough to ask questions and demand answers. Clara would never be forgotten again. Nor would the thousands of other children like her stolen, enslaved, and all but name, worked to death in institutions that claimed to be reforming them. Their stories were finally being told, their graves finally being marked, their names finally being spoken with the honor and grief they deserved. The truth behind the 1880 family photograph had been darker than anyone imagined. But bringing that truth to light, painful as it was, served as both memorial and warning, a reminder of what humans are capable of doing to the powerless and why we must never stop looking, questioning, and bearing witness to uncomfortable histories.